Hello and welcome to Latina Republic's Refugee Resettlement interview with Chris George, Executive Director of Integrated Refugee and Immigrant Services, or IRIS, a resettlement organization based in New Haven, Connecticut. My name is Erica Drufva, she/her pronouns, and I'm currently interning as a policy analyst for Latina Republic. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization based in California, and we cover a broad range of stories that extend from Latin America, such as social issues and human rights issues. Through the reporting that is done on these stories, the organization has been able to advocate for various communities and, in turn, provide a platform that empowers those who haven't had their stories heard or circulated through mainstream media enough. So right now, we're focusing on making policy recommendations for the government's reimagining of the refugee resettlement program. Refugee and asylum seeker issues are an extremely important topic for Latina Republic because we're very focused on the rights of migrants in general and on undocumented people. So with that, let's jump into the interview. What does the process look like when a refugee arrives here and steps foot in the United States for getting resettled?
Sure. Well, if you don't mind, I think I'm going to begin overseas because an
Yeah,
important
sure.
part of the process does happen overseas, and this is a public-private partnership. We do work closely with the government, and the government handles the overseas part. So the Department of State and the Department of Homeland Security will select and then vet. They'll conduct a security vetting process for refugees overseas. And that can take sometimes 2, 3, 4 years. And once a refugee has made it through the vetting process, and it's a very intense, rigorous, it is deeply personal, some of the questions. Often it re-traumatizes people because they're asked to recount the persecution that they've suffered, which is what qualifies them for the refugee program. They make it through that. They go through a cursory, maybe less cursory nowadays, health screening process. And once it's determined they won't be a public health risk, they don't have COVID or active TB or anything else, they're invited to come to the United States. And we'll get an email about 2 weeks before they arrive that says, family of 5 from Syria, family of 4 from Iraq, family of 8 from Afghanistan, wherever, arriving in 2 or 3 weeks. My staff need to spring into action, find an apartment, furnish it with donated furniture, stock the kitchen with a few days worth of food, find someone who can cook a hot meal that's culturally appropriate hot meal to serve them when they arrive. We get all this ready. They arrive, at a nearby airport, usually JFK. They're met there by someone from the UN who puts them in a vehicle, a minivan. They come up 95. They arrive in New Haven. We welcome them to Connecticut. Welcome to New Haven. Welcome to IRIS, and take them to their apartment. That's been beautifully set up. And they have that hot meal. They have a good night's sleep. The next day, we bring them into the office. And this is a process that virtually every refugee goes through. And this is a series of services that every refugee resettlement agency in the country has to do. There are about 200 refugee resettlement agencies in the country. And somewhere in the United States, there is a family arriving and they're being served a culturally appropriate hot meal. They're being taken to their apartment. Or where was I in the process? They're sat down by a case manager the next day who then goes over the program. Here it is.
Okay.
We're going to connect you to healthcare. We're going to enroll your kids in school. We're going to help you learn English well enough to get a job. We're going to help you get that job. And then you're on your own. It is a tough, demanding, self-help, you have to hit the ground running kind of a social assistance program. And we will help people only as long as they need help. And we take a pretty tough approach to how long they need help. Today's refugee resettlement program is pretty much based on the United States immigrant experience that, the older generations talk about wistfully, like, came with nothing, came only with the clothes on my back, and crammed into a small apartment with my relatives. Took the first job that was offered to me, even though it was way beneath, anything I ever did in my home country. But I didn't speak English, so I had no choice. So
Mhm.
the parents will get jobs. The kids will start learning English very quickly. Before you know it, they're interpreting for their family. And, the parents will get promoted. They'll be able to pay their bills. They'll begin to integrate into the community. And it's an amazing, transformative experience for the refugees and also for people who work in refugee resettlement. It is just a very satisfying, uplifting, difficult, rewarding program. And our goal at IRIS is to involve as many Americans, just ordinary Americans, involve as many of them as we possibly can in this program so they can learn about refugees and support the refugee resettlement tradition.
Wow. Okay, great. And so how is this like helping people find food, furniture, housing? How is all of this funded? And like when is the refugee like expected to start to be able to pay for everything on their own?
Yeah. So we get a little bit of money from the US government, from the Department of State in the beginning. We get roughly $1,200 to run our program per person. So for every refugee who arrives at IRIS, the US government will give us $1,200 so I can hire case managers and education coordinators and rent an office. And then the refugee will get $1,200 to cover their expenses one time per person. So, Erica, say you're a member of a family of 5 from
Mhm.
Syria. Um, your family would get roughly $6,000, and Iris would get roughly $6,000 to cover our expenses. Now, if there are 100 refugees coming in a given year, it's 100 times those amounts for Iris. And again, each refugee family gets per capita 1,200. If we resettle 500, then our administrative share is going to be 500 times $1,200. So that is the biggest part of our annual income, the per capita allocation from the State Department. And it's the same for just about every refugee resettlement agency. There is additional funding that comes from the Department of Health and Human Services, and that's typically for to be spent on refugees who've been here more than 3 or 4 months. So the State Department covers the first 3 months, and then we can try for other grants from the Office of Refugee Resettlement in the Department of Health and Human Services to get additional funding. But that's government funding. And government funding will cover the basics, but refugees need more than just the basics.
Mhm.
And a refugee agency really needs to go out and raise private funding to supplement the government money that comes in. And we've been blessed with a very generous community. So here in New Haven and throughout Connecticut, there are a lot of people who really believe in this program, and they have contributed financially so that we're able to do the extras that refugees need.
Great. And so you said it's kind of like a program to get the refugees like right on their feet. And then, so is it common then after all of that funding for refugees to be expected to pay for like their own healthcare, own rent and such?
Yeah,
Okay.
well, good question. It's important to know that um, someone who comes through the refugee resettlement program is eligible for a lot of those safety net benefits that Americans are eligible for. So, for example, Medicaid, food stamps, temporary cash assistance. They have work authorization, which is really important. And they are eligible, of course, for the services that we provide. They're all attached to a refugee resettlement agency. And they get that little bit of housing assistance. That per capita money is basically housing assistance. They get that in the beginning. And yes, you're right. They're expected. It's a little unreasonable because the federal money really only lasts about 3 months. They're expected to become self-sufficient very quickly. Very few can do it in 3 months. Usually it takes 6 months, for some a little bit longer. And everyone is different. Say you're the oldest daughter of a family from, Afghanistan, and let's say your mother is a little unusual. She speaks English, your father speaks English. You've got 2 younger brothers and sisters, they're in school. Well, your mother and father could both work, right? And they could get jobs, and even if they're minimum wage jobs, that combined income is probably going to cover your rent and utilities. You're going to be eligible for cash assistance. You're eligible for food stamps, and your medical expenses are going to be covered because you have insurance. So, your family has a pretty good shot after 4 or 5 months of becoming self-sufficient and not depending on additional funding from IRIS.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. And then to move on a little bit, when refugees arrive, is it common for refugees to arrive with their whole family, or do they come individually? And do you see people like file for have their family join them, or how does that typically work?
Yeah. Well, both things happen. If you're lucky and there isn't a war breaking out that forces you to do things very quickly in an urgent way, you might be able to apply for your whole family, and your whole family leaves at the same time. Often wars divide people.
Mm-hmm.
I've talked to families who had to flee in the middle of the night. 2 or 3 family members went out the front door, others went out the back door, and they didn't see each other for years later. So you will also have cases where people apply on their own, part of the family. They come to the United States, and even before they've arrived in their apartment, on the drive from the IRIS office to their apartment, they'll immediately start talking about getting their relatives here. How can I get my father here? How can I bring my oldest son here? How can I bring, my wife and children here? And we have a legal department that helps them complete the applications and leads them through the process for that family reunification.
Oh, that's great. And where are the refugees that IRIS helps typically coming from?
Nowadays, almost all of them from Afghanistan.
Okay.
As you know, last summer, the Taliban took over very quickly. The U.S. government evacuated almost 100,000 Afghans. Most of them came almost immediately to the United States and were put on military bases. Others were, and still are, on bases all over the European region and the Middle East, and they're gradually coming here now. But almost all from Afghanistan. The next group would probably be Syrians and their relatives of those who came in 2015 and 2016 and 2017, before the Trump administration put almost a complete halt to the refugee program.
Mm-hmm.
And we're beginning to see some Ukrainians. Now, Ukrainians, of course, we refer to them as refugees from Ukraine, but they don't technically have refugee status. Their immigration status here in the United States is not that of refugee. They're coming through a program called humanitarian parole, but the US government has decided to, in a way, treat them like refugees. So all those benefits that I mentioned, the Ukrainians will be eligible for.
Okay. Wonderful. So what are some of the main issues that you see with the US refugee resettlement program today?
Well, the the biggest issue is it is dominated by private voluntary organizations, professional nonprofit groups like mine. I mean, we're professional, but we're also, nonprofit, very nonprofit. And what has happened over the years is the U.S. government requirements are pretty intense, and many of the refugee resettlement agencies are afraid that they're not going to meet the government requirements, so they have really cut back on their use of volunteers. This was over the years until recently. There was a real drop off in the amount of community engagement. And recently, we've realized that actually we should be involving as many volunteers as possible. If we can train them and give them an orientation and supervise them well, they'll do a great job. So now, over the past couple of years, there has been a real move on the part of the refugee resettlement community to place refugee families with volunteer groups. And that is a welcomed and long overdue development, because what it means is we are swinging open the doors of refugee resettlement and allowing Americans to participate in this great tradition. And why is that such a great thing? It will build public support. The best way to get the public, the American public, to support refugee resettlement and to vote for elected officials who also support refugee resettlement, the best way is to educate them about refugee resettlement and involve them. And the best way to educate and involve them is to say, form a community group, we'll train you, and we'll place a refugee in your community. Nothing like that. It is so much more, profound. The experience is so much more profound, and the connection you make with the refugee is so much stronger than if you are asked by a refugee agency to drive someone to a medical appointment and back, and that's it. Or, hey, can you and your church group come in and set up an apartment? And then you're a member of the church group and you say, hi, director of refugee resettlement agency, can we also meet the family after they arrive? And often the director would say, no, you can't do that. We got to protect our privacy. Come on. I mean, if you want people to have a rich experience and better understand refugees and refugee resettlement, you have to figure out ways for them to interact with refugees. And that's why this model that we use in Connecticut, the community-based refugee resettlement model, is so powerful, because it gives people this experience of doing, all those things that I mentioned my staff does. Find an apartment, volunteers can do that. Furnish the apartment, volunteers can do that. Meet the family when they arrive, piece of cake. Enroll kids in school, connect them to healthcare, help somebody get a job, help people learn English, show them around the neighborhood. These are things that people have done. You can do it. Now, yes, it is tough, and there are difficulties when you're doing it with a family that doesn't speak much English. They come from another culture, but just makes it more enjoyable and more interesting. So This is what needs to be done across the board. You see all those red squares on the map there,
Hmm.
Connecticut. Each square is a community group that has welcomed a refugee family. That should be happening in every state. And it's not, but it should be. And it will be, because the State Department is now convinced that this is the way to go. And they're going to be promoting what they call private sponsorship or community co-sponsorship in the future. So I'm excited. I think it's really going to open things up, and it will lead to a public, an American public that understands refugees better, supports them, and we will never again elect someone whose campaign promise was to destroy the refugee resettlement program. We have to make sure that never, ever happens again.
Yeah. Um, Segueing in nicely, I was going to ask you what you think of Biden's private sponsorship program. So have they started the pilot program yet? I believe not. Or have
They
they?
announced they have asked for proposals from the nonprofit groups, and today there are more groups that are doing community-based / private sponsorship than ever before. So they should get some good proposals.
That's wonderful to know. Um, all right. And also, what are the main issues you see affecting refugees like when they arrive?
The key really is learning English. Um, and that is a hurdle that if you don't get over it, it is going to have a huge impact on the kind of work you can get, on your ability to integrate, navigate the new culture and society. So needing to learn English, refugees really need to learn English as quickly as possible. There are some health issues for some that even will be more critical than learning English and need attention immediately. There are some mental health issues that will need attention immediately. Many Afghans are under so much pressure and stress, um, partly from the people they left behind, from their friends and relatives who were not lucky enough to be evacuated, who were not able to fight their way through those horrible crowds at Kabul airport in August to get on a plane. Um, and they're constantly calling and texting people here in the United States saying, hey, you're in the United States now. Why can't you help me? Um, so that's stressful. Um, and um, we do our best to try to address those needs.
Yeah, I'm sure. And what are your thoughts on refugee quotas? And do you think maybe the private sponsorship program will be a way for us to increase these refugee quotas?
Yeah. Um, so the president traditionally is responsible for setting the quota. They call it the cap, the annual refugee arrivals cap. How many refugees are going to come in a given year? And historically, the average year cap has been around 85,000. Biden has said he wants to bring in 125,000. Honestly, there are some people, including myself, who think the number should be closer to 200,000. And one of the advantages of a private sponsorship program alongside the one that we have now, I mean, we're not talking about getting rid of these large voluntary organizations that do refugee resettlement. Many of them do great work. I mean, I'm part of that network. Some of my best friends are professional refugee resettlement people, and we're not talking about getting rid of that. That will remain, and it'll remain strong, and it'll get better and better. But we're talking about adding a complementary program that allows private individuals to bring refugees here and to resettle them along the lines of this community-based model we use here in Connecticut. So those two programs working hand in hand, in tandem, should allow us to get our numbers up to around 200,000. That would be a decent goal. This country has the resources. It is, not the kind of thing where, oh my gosh, it's going to cost us a fortune. The refugee resettlement program is very modestly funded.
Mhm.
Sure, now and then I'll give a talk at a Rotary Club or a synagogue or a church, and someone will say, why should we be helping people from other countries when our own neighbors and friends and relatives right here in the United States need so much help? And the answer is very simple. We can do both. We have to do both. We have the resources to do both. Of course, we have to help people who were born in this country. And for every refugee resettlement agency, there should be 1,000 nonprofits that provide assistance to the general public. And when you count them in Connecticut, there actually are. For
Amazing.
every refugee agency, there are 1,000 nonprofits that provide services to the general public. But at the same time, we should also have a strong refugee resettlement program. We should set an example for other governments around the world. And through that example, the total number of refugees who are resettled across the globe will go up. But right now, it's kind of hard to sit at a conference in Geneva surrounded by representatives from other countries and say, hey, you guys need to have a larger refugee resettlement program because ours is still so small. So the Biden administration needs to get in gear and get serious about this. If you say you want to bring 125,000 at least, then let's do it.
Because I've seen that only about, is it 9,000 refugees have been resettled this year? So what do you think the main issue is? Is it the Trump administration's cutbacks, or how can we move forward from this and get to that 200,000?
Yeah. Now, keep in mind, 9,000 traditional refugees plus 80,000 Afghan evacuees.
Oh, okay, great.
Yes. So we're really at like 89,000, which is, and the refugee resettlement agencies resettled almost all of those 80,000, and it nearly killed us because so many came over such a short period of time. So yes, we need to get the numbers up. And I'm sorry, what was your question?
Like, how can the Biden administration get these numbers up? Because
They complain that the reason why they're not able to get the numbers up so quickly is because the previous administration decimated the overseas part of this program. The processing centers, it cut back on staff, it closed down programs and offices. And it is taking longer, they say, to get that back up and running again. Okay, so it's taking longer, but let's just put more resources into it. Where there's a will, there's a way. And I'm just worried that there isn't a strong enough will.
Okay. So hopefully with this private sponsorship, we'll get more people involved in wanting to help resettle refugees and vote more people into office who want to do that. So that's great. And then just for, I think the last question, do you see any specific needs of migrants who are members of like particularly marginalized communities like the LGBTQ community or women that the US State Department could like better be supporting?
Yeah, we can definitely do a better job of bringing more hope to members of the LGBTQ community who've suffered persecution and others and small minority groups that probably historically for hundreds of years have been persecuted or just at least discriminated against in some countries. And the State Department, uh, in its outreach and through its partnerships with UN agencies around the world, need to get the word out that the US government refugee resettlement program is a way for people to have a life, to get out of the abusive environment that they're in now. And, even when they go to a refugee camp, I mean, you know, let's be honest, sad reality is that a member of the LGBTQ community who flees Syria because of persecution and is in a refugee camp in Jordan, they're still going to face persecution um, in that refugee camp, I'm sure. So they really need to be focused on better outreach and given, I would even say preferential treatment um, so that they can come to safety and have a life in this country.
Okay, great. And I do have one more question if you have time. So I know that the Uniting for Ukraine program is a humanitarian parole, so it's a little different. But have you seen like the response? Do you think the response to Ukrainian refugees can be? It was very strong, right? And everyone had
Well,
their
we all
arms
know
wide
we
open.
all know why.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think it
Yeah,
could?
well, I mean, let's be honest. A lot of Americans were saying they look like us. They speak English. Oh my God, most of these women look like models. Let's resettle them in the United States. I mean, come on. So yes, and the incredible discrimination at the border when they flew to Mexico and then crossed the border, they were like jumping ahead in line, getting in front of poor families who had been waiting in line for months from Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador, and these well-dressed people from Ukraine with white skin and nice suitcases just move right to the front of the line. Look, I'm not blaming the Ukrainians. Absolutely not. I mean, my God, they fled war. They lost loved ones. They had to leave their husbands or fathers behind to fight. They're terrified about what's happening. So it's not their fault. I blame the U.S. government for being racist in their policies and giving them preferential treatment, and the result is it turns some people against the Ukrainians. That's the last thing we want.
Yeah. Do you think so with this like wide open arm acceptance of Ukrainians, do you think it has shown something that like the US system can do more to accept other refugees, or do you think we've learned anything from accepting so many Ukrainian refugees that we'll be able to like revamp and grow this system for people from everywhere else and for, Latin Americans as well and yeah.
Well, I think the lessons there probably will be some lessons learned from the Ukrainian experience, and we're beginning to learn them. But the big lessons learned came from the Afghan evacuation experience last fall, when again 78,000 Afghans were brought to the United States and placed on military bases around the country, and the US government had to place them into communities, had to resettle them in 3 to 4 months. So the big lesson we learned was, number one, we never should have allowed the refugee resettlement agencies of this country to be weakened as they were during the previous administration. You should never allow that to happen again. They have to remain strong because you never know when they're going to have to move quickly. The other lesson we learned was that in order to have the flexibility to expand and accept many more refugees over a short period of time, to have that capacity to expand, you need to have a private sponsorship program. I mean, at IRIS, 40% of the Afghans we resettled, we placed with community groups. By April, it was up to 40%. If we didn't have that, if we didn't have those community groups, there's no way we would have been able to resettle 600 Afghans. So every refugee agency needs to have a community-based or private sponsorship program so that when necessary, in an emergency, you can quickly increase your capacity.